It's Thursday, June 26th, 2025, and we have two isolated marginal risk, one up here in large parts of Montana, then kind of a marginal risk down here that kind of has the shape of a donut with a bite taken out of it right here in parts of northeast Texas into northern Louisiana. And our marginal risk extends from the southern plains all the way up into the Midwest, all the way down into the Northeast, then the Mid-Atlantic, then pretty much the entire Southeast. So although our risk of severe weather isn't very high tomorrow, it's a very large risk with loads of people in it. We can see that we have over 100 million people at risk for severe weather tomorrow. This is going to be almost entirely a wind and hail threat. We have a 5% risk of severe winds up here in Montana. Then in our weird shaped risk, which extends from the southern plains, Midwest, into the Mid-Atlantic then Southeast. And then we have a much smaller 5% risk of hail tomorrow, which extends from Alabama all the way up into Maryland. Tracking back to our overall risk area, I wouldn't be surprised to see an upgrade to a slight risk up here in parts of the Midwest, including northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and parts of eastern Iowa. For Friday, we have a slight risk of severe storms up here in the northern plains, then another marginal risk down here in the Mid-Atlantic to Southeast, with an all hazards threat up here in our northern plains risk area, and mostly a wind threat down here in our Mid-Atlantic to Southeastern risk area. Here's our simulated reflectivity, and pretty quickly we'll see an area that has more severe characteristics over pretty much anywhere else, and that's going to be up here in parts of the Midwest where we have a remnant low from a mesoscale convective system, which is supposed to redevelop into the mid or early afternoon hours, and we have a reinforced boundary which is going to be draped right across central Wisconsin and southern Minnesota, which could increase the spin in the atmosphere and maybe allow storms to be more powerful. One thing that catches my eye midday is a pretty discrete storm out here, which looks like it's attached itself to the boundary out here in central Wisconsin. And interesting, the SPC has gone ahead and not issued a tornado risk for really any area, but this is definitely an area where tornadoes could be possible if a solution like this were to unfold. Now back to our main cluster of storms, as we push into the mid to late afternoon, we see that wind threat really materialize with a pretty organized line right here across a larger boundary, which extends down into the central and southern plains. Then even another secondary line of storms up here near that boundary. And these storms are going to be producing mostly wind and small hail, but the possibility of spin up tornadoes is also going to be non-zero. Another area of interest is going to be down here from Kansas into parts of southern Iowa and northern Missouri, where we have a secondary low in our line. And as we move further into the afternoon and eventually evening hours, we get some more organization down here in this region, which is going to be associated with that low, and these storms could also pose that severe potential. Moving on to another interesting area, here is our southeastern simulated reflectivity, and we can see a cluster of storms out here which actually develops in very early Thursday morning. And what we're going to see with this cluster is that it's actually going to leave an outflow boundary across the region, which could be sort of instrumental for storms developing over the span of the day. Moving closer to sunrise, we can see that outflow boundary is going to be really large, and it's going to be spread apart across Alabama, the Florida Panhandle, and even up here in central Georgia. And then in the morning hours, we're going to see our line actually redevelop a bit right here near the Louisiana-Mississippi border, where definitely a couple of severe storms are possible with a strong storm cluster like this. And then back in parts in Alabama, by the early afternoon, we're going to see some development along that outflow boundary with a couple of somewhat organized storms the ARRR is actually portraying. And then our sea breezes are actually going to clash down here in Florida, which are going to develop storms along the western coast of the state, which could also cluster and become powerful and even severe. Another thing we see is a lot of scattered storms out here, which is just going to be initiated by peak heating. And there is also a frontal zone, which will be draped across the east. But storms like this aren't really expected to pose that much of a severe threat, except in the case where sometimes they can cluster and pose a very small isolated threat. And then reaching sunset, where our low-level jet kicks up a bit, we actually see a pretty formidable line of storms push from Alabama into Mississippi. So that's also going to be an area of interest tomorrow at sunset. But as we move into the early night hours and further into the night, it looks like storms back here are going to overall dissipate entirely. Here's our mid-Atlantic simulated reflectivity. And as we go around midday, we're going to see a couple of areas of interest back here near Michigan, where there's going to be a low pressure system, and then that reinforced boundary. And then back here in parts of southern New York, where there's also going to be another low, but this one's going to be left by a mesoscale convective system, and this is also going to be fueled partially by that boundary as well. So by 1 p.m., these storm clusters are expected to get somewhat organized and will likely be bringing strong winds, if not severe, to these regions. And then just more storm clusters out here, which will be initiated by peak heating. And if some can cluster together, they could possibly become severe. And in the mid-Atlantic, it looks like as we go into late afternoon into the evening hours, there's expected to be pretty persistent storms out here, but a lot of these aren't really expected to be super strong. So mostly just the threat of lots of rain and some isolated areas of severe winds. Our last area of interest is going to be back here in the parts of the southern plains, where in central Oklahoma we have a low pressure system which could bring a couple of strong, maybe severe storms out here. And back in our upper plains convergence zone in eastern New Mexico and pushing into parts of western Texas, we also see a lot of convection back there, which would also possibly bring a wind threat to that region. Here are 500 millibar winds, and we can see tomorrow that we're actually expecting a short wave to overspread our Midwest risk area. And then weak troughing will extend back into the southern plains. So that is one of the reasons for storms out here across this region. And then we just have overall some flow out here across parts of the northern to northeastern United States, which could also cause some storms up here near our flow. And then there's also an area with some troughing back here in Montana, which is cause for that marginal risk. And it also looks like there's going to be a warm front, cold front, low pressure system setup back here, which would normally be interesting, but confidence in storm coverage is going to be fairly low, and the ingredients up there are not super intense. Another reason why I think we might see an upgrade to our risk up here in the Midwest is some pretty solid 700 millibar flow in the region, which would help to support that threat for all hazards and possibly make storms stronger. And another reason for that conditional risk up here in Montana is going to be some of that 700 millibar flow as well. Here's a sounding from our Midwest risk area, and our hodograph actually looks pretty conducive for some storms of severe strength. We see a pretty big curve in our hodograph, and then our low level helicity is going to be nearing 300, and our low level shear is going to be nearing 30. Then our bulk shear, so our updraft sustaining and strengthening shear, is also going to be of that 40 knot threshold at 47 knots. So very favorable shear and helicity for these storms. We also see some very light veering in our winds, but it doesn't appear to be so much that it would really be a big variable tomorrow. And our lowest cloud level would also be enough to support possibly a tornado threat out here. Now, the big issue with this setup is going to be low lapse rates and a capped atmosphere, which could really make these storms struggle to organize. And then also a fairly stable environment with not even 500 Kate. So that is a big reason why there are questions about how strong these storms will be tomorrow and why that's only going to be a marginal risk. Although with the way the models are trending, I do definitely think a slight is still in play. And there still is ample moisture for storms, and our precipitable water will be 1.69 inches accompanied by a 1100 downdraft Cape. So that's another reason why that threat of severe winds could be supported despite this overall pretty stable atmosphere. So in summary, weak lapse rates, a capped atmosphere, and a pretty stable atmosphere are causing a lot of questions about storm intensity, but the shear is going to be very favorable. So I do think there will possibly be a threat for severe winds and possibly a couple of tornadoes out here in this region in the Midwest. And then here's a weather sounding from our southeastern risk area. Our hodograph doesn't really look conducive for any specific types of severe weather. And we also don't see a lot of veering in our winds, and our low level helicity is going to be quite low. Our low level shear is going to be really low, and our bulk shear is also going to be low. So not very favorable shear for our storms out here, but that's not going to be the main driver behind these storms. It's going to be decent lapse rates, abundant moisture, which would support all hazards of severe weather, and also abundant instability, which eclipse 5,000, so a very juiced up atmosphere in the southeast. There's also some dry air aloft, which could mix in and accelerate those downdrafts, which would support that risk for severe winds. We do see a decent bit of cape up here near our freezing level, as well as our decent lapse rates, which we already talked about, which could support that risk of some small hail down here in the southeast, which is definitely more rare for this region, but it's still possible. Our precipitable water is going to be 1.87 inches, as well as our downdraft cape is going to be 1,200. So that would also help to support that threat for severe winds. And our 3 cape is going to be nearing 200 at 178. So that would support threat for wind and hail. And then because our lowest cloud level is low enough to support a tornado threat, a weak tornado or a water spout cannot be ruled out in this region either, although it is extremely unlikely. So in summary, there is a very real threat for severe winds out here, the possibility of small hail, and the possibility of possibly 1 or 2 weak tornadoes. And before the video ends, I want to take a peek at our more long-term weather patterns. So there's our current weather pattern moving off and our new one coming in. We could see our northern plains risk area kind of reinvigorate itself and bring some severe weather up there with a jet over the weekend and into next week. And it looks like this flow in the northern United States is going to continue, but it's going to adopt a more northwesterly flow attitude, which would possibly mean a more wind-oriented risk for parts of the central plains into the southeast and mid-Atlantic. So it looks like that is going to be our main trend next week. And a little surprised, Wednesday, 2 weeks out, we see a pretty potent shortwave push into our northern plains risk area. So that's something to keep our eye on and see if that holds. And the heat wave has been a big story recently, and it looks like that is going to persist for at least a couple more days out here. In the east, we're still seeing very hot temperatures nearing 100 and probably surpassing 100. And it looks like this is going to continue for at least into the weekend before it kind of subsides and things go back to normal.